Ladies and gentlemen, please be upstanding to welcome President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, and his wife, Sabina Higgins.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Mansion House. In case of emergency, please note the fire exits. May we ask you to please make sure your mobile phones and pagers are completely switched off. Due to the solemnity of the evening, we ask you not to applaud during any part of the evening. Thank you.
This evening's Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration is being live streamed. Some of the readings have been pre-recorded. Some footage has been used from previous years. Our youth readers are winners of the Mary Elms Prize in Holocaust Studies and members of BBYO Youth Organization. Every year on this evening of commemoration, we solemnly mark Holocaust Memorial Day here in Dublin. This year will mark 80 years since the end of the Second World War, when the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. We remember 6 million Jewish people murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. And we remember millions of other persecuted minorities who were victims of Nazi atrocities. This evening's ceremony provides us with the opportunity to cherish the memory of those who perished and to reflect on the consequences of the Holocaust. I invite the Lord Mayor of Dublin, Emma Blaine, to welcome you.
On behalf of the city and people of Dublin, it is a great honour to host this important national event which is held every year in Dublin. We feel privileged to be here among survivors of the Holocaust and descendants of survivors who have made Dublin and Ireland their home. We also welcome representatives of all the victim groups who live amongst us here in Ireland. Holocaust Memorial Day marks the date of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau on the 27th of January 1945. Tonight, we recall the suffering inflicted on the Jewish people of Europe and on those of other faiths and ethnicities who were persecuted during the Holocaust. We reflect on this and on the suffering still being inflicted on people throughout the world today. We acknowledge the work of Holocaust Education Ireland in its endeavours to educate and inform about the Holocaust, and ensure that it is never denied or distorted, but always remembered.
I invite President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, to address us.
Gomashirkan Linilyaga Sadrin Akojan. Today is a significant National Holocaust Memorial Day, taking place as it does, as you have just heard, on the eve of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest of what were a network of Nazi concentration camps. As Maruktra Nahiran, may I thank Professor Thomas O'Dowd, Chairperson of Holocaust Education Ireland, for the invitation to be part of the ceremony with you. May I say what an honour it is once more, on this Holocaust Memorial Day 2025, to have Holocaust survivors Susie Diamond and Tommy Reichenthal with us. That is so important. This is how Professor Enda McDonough put it at one of the earliest papers he gave on human rights. To remember in the moral sense required here, we need some informed awareness of the range of horror in number and kind of victims, as detailed in the many excellent histories. But we perhaps need even more to share the sense of intense suffering conveyed by the witness of the victims and their survivors. That was how Enda McDonough put it. He saw in the public reaction to the opening of the gates at Auschwitz-Birkenau a huge influence on the development and the possibilities of human rights. In communal memory, there are foundational spaces. The Holocaust is such a space, important for all of humanity, of special significance to the relatives and those of a shared fate, of those it sought to genocidally eliminate. What people could see at the opening of the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau was not only the dead, the emaciated. They were confronted with the consequences of something that had a complex design and history, a cruelty aimed at the extermination of the Jewish population of Europe and the objects of life that were their intimacies, that they had brought with them. And with them were included other categories, the disabled, Romani, those of same-sexual orientation, all defined as another to be eliminated. It is important that each generation allows itself to be moved by the range of intimacies that are revealed in the details of the objects that have been preserved at former concentration camps, which I saw myself at Auschwitz-Birkenau when I visited in 2020 to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation with fellow heads of state. It is important that all in each generation and political leaders are made acutely aware of not just the consequences of an attempted genocide, but of the complicit actions of silence, of the averted gaze of those who, by their culpable indifference, allowed the Holocaust to be planned, prepared, and to occur. And of course, there were those who refused to respond to that desperate pleas from those who were seeking refuge from it. So may I suggest that the role of education in ethical remembrance of the Holocaust is of immense importance. It is education in all its diverse and emancipatory forms that can play a critical role in ensuring not only that an atrocity like the Holocaust never happens again, but that a basis for building a peaceful future can be made possible. That is why the work of Holocaust Education Ireland is so important, playing as it does a crucial role in ensuring that Ireland abides by its commitments under the 2000 Stockholm Declaration to counter anti-Semitism. Holocaust denial, distortion of the Holocaust facts, and xenophobia and racism in its many insidious guises through the provision of accurate, comprehensive information about prejudice, discrimination, hate speech, and misinformation. Such important work as the Foundation does ensures that factual and historical accuracy endures with inclusivity and respect for all people, human dignity and human rights are values that we must strive to uphold and promote in our contemporary conditions. We must ensure that every generation understands how the horrors of the Holocaust came to be, and we must draw from what that teaches us 80 years on. Described by so many writers as the nadir of basic human thought and action to which humanity might sink, it must be addressed how such dehumanization, with their assumptions, its discourse and practice, came to be so effective, institutionally facilitated, and with such little resistance. There are those who, at its emergence, even went so far as to welcome its authoritarian assumptions, offered behind a mask of ensuring order, be they politicians or newspaper editors across Europe. One of the very earliest lectures I attended on the origins of the human rights movement was that of Enda MacDonagh, to whom I've already referred. He took the Holocaust as a departure point for what he hoped would be a catalyst for human rights and a shared purpose for their vindication. He would later write about the amorality of indifference or silence in relation to human rights breaches. Those who attend Holocaust Memorial each year understand and appreciate the significance and the bravery and courage of those who, having suffered a great loss, are carrying a deep wound and yet are seeking to reach beyond this pain, encouraging us all to strive for a definition of the other that respects our essential humanity, has respect for a diversity of experiences, ethnicity, or the differing foundations and aspects of collective memory which have to be taken into account. If we are to achieve an enduring peace and a life together that would reward such efforts, it will require us to meet the human rights requirements of which Dr. MacDonagh spoke, the right to security, but also the vindication of redress and participation rights in society in their fullest sense. Regrettably, this important and challenging task of confronting those historical and contextual circumstances that permitted the Holocaust are again needed. We live in times when it seems acceptable by some to imply hatred of the other as a rhetorical tool, to use hate speech openly, be it in public or online, thus fanning the flames of intolerance and bigotry, promoting difference as a source of fear. We live in a world that is enduring a period of rising political authoritarianism, polarization, and violence. Such an atmosphere threatens democracy, promotes racism, division, exclusion. For far too many, the averting of one's gaze is now seen as an acceptable indifference. It is as if the best of aspirations for a cohesive world in conditions of change are being perceived as a lost cause, even an obstacle. We now live once again in a period in which war is hegemonic in the discourse, suggestive as this is of the impotence of an informed diplomacy or meaningful negotiations that would seek to understand the history and the assumptions of an adversary, rather than a concerted effort to build a mind of war. What humanity needs now is the building of a mind of peace. It will be difficult work, but we must cooperate to envisage and deliver peace. We are given examples in such a task by those such as Israeli peace activist Mao Zedong and Palestinian peace activist Aziz Abu Sara, who, while each carrying a near unbearable grief of loss, are asking us to listen to each other, to reconcile our divided narratives, and through such a mutual recognition as can deliver a shared peaceful future. As Mao Zedong put it, we must forgive for the past, we must forgive for the present, but we must not and should not forgive for the future. Or in the words of Aziz Abu Sara, we must not let anger drown us in hate and vengeance. Holocaust Memorial Day presents an important opportunity to ensure that the message which the Holocaust teaches us must never be lost with the passage of time, as Primo Levi feared, that neither must we be dilatory in promoting and vindicating those human rights commitments, frail as they may be, that have been globally agreed since the Holocaust, and which must apply without qualification as to boundaries, cultural systems, or nationalisms. It is a day for all to recall and respond to the reality of a shared but diverse humanity, one that was rejected and defiled by an attempted genocide, a day to remember all those millions of people martyred, the 6 million Jewish people, and millions more who were murdered for their religion, ethnicity, political beliefs, disability, or sexual orientation, in their simply carrying the name of being different because of some characteristic intrinsic to their being, something that was an essential part of their identity. Ethical remembrance is an important resource, but ethical remembrance must actively take the responsibility of addressing the sources that are seeking to stoke old divisions and bitterness. As Dr. McDonough stressed, remembrance must never circumvent the responsibilities of the present, dealing with the very real problems of living in peace with our neighbours. Across the different religious systems there is, I believe, a common stress that revenge is a lessening of the human spirit rather than its fullest expression. That a seeking of justice, while more difficult, demands something much more, and yet is of the essence of humanity. It is to be hoped, I believe, that those in Israel who mourn their loved ones, those who have been waiting for the release of hostages, or the thousands searching for relatives in the rubble in Gaza, will welcome the long overdue ceasefire for which there has been such a heavy price paid. The grief inflicted on families by the horrific acts of October 7th, and the response to it is unimaginable. The loss of civilian life, the majority women and children, their displacement, loss of homes and necessary institutions for life itself. How can the world, and I often ask, continue to look at the empty bowls of the starving? The current agreement must end the killing, but as a matter of urgency deliver the massive scale-up in humanitarian need which is urgently needed to save more lives. It is important that all remaining hostages are released and that all phases of the agreement are fully implemented. It is to be hoped that the agreement will not only bring an end to the horrific loss of life and destruction which has taken place, but that it will also mark the beginning of the meaningful discussions, the sustained diplomatic initiatives which have been missing from the international community with tragic consequences, and that it will commence a meaningful peace and security to Israel, Palestine and the greater region, a peace that will address the root causes of the conflict as well as its aftermath and be premised on the upholding of human rights. When wars and conflicts become accepted or presented as seemingly unending, humanity is the loser. War is not the natural condition of humanity. Cooperation is. We must recover and assert that principle at every level, nationally, regionally, internationally. We must never lack the courage to challenge hatred and persecution in whatever forms they ought to be manifested. by promoting a world that is free from persecutions based on difference, such as faith or ethnicity, by embracing diversity, by working for equality, peace, and justice, thus making possible a world that is free too from so many of the sources of war and conflict based on a distorted reflection of the other. Theologian and philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin saw such a peaceful state as being achievable through a species evolution in human consciousness, believing that humankind is not only capable of living in peace, but by its very structure cannot fail eventually to achieve peace. He suggested that the concord that must ultimately prevail on earth will materialize as a cohesion pervaded and inspired with the same energies which were previously wasted in bloodshed, unanimity in search and conquest, sustained among us by the universal resolve to raise ourselves upwards, all straining shoulder to shoulder towards ever greater heights of consciousness and freedom. National Holocaust Memorial Day assists in such a task, as Chardin envisaged, of achieving lasting concord by bringing, as it does, people from different backgrounds for an occasion that promotes the essential empathy that is sourced and drawn from our shared humanity, stressing the importance of learning from the past and the taking of the necessary actions for a more peaceful future. As the poisons of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, racism, homophobia, and intolerance are once again on the rise in many parts of the world. I repeat those words because they are the words as I have described them over the years, and we must ensure that the lessons that the foundational event that the Holocaust offers to the world, with such extraordinary but planned cruelty and hatred, based on the regarding of others as lesser, inferior in rights or participation, are heard and understood. The Holocaust was enabled by a regime of systematic murder that began by the manipulation of language and the spreading of fear. We in our times must be alert to the identification and confrontation of hate speech in any of its many guises. We must work together to ensure that hatred and anti-migrant sentiment, for example, in our time, are not permitted to deepen their dark shadow across Europe and the world. Hope is an action, not just an aspiration. May we all continue to plant the alternative seeds of hope and peace, seeds that may yield a more harmonious coexistence on this shared vulnerable planet. Enable us, when we are put to the test again and again, however unjustly, to choose reconciliation. May we achieve such an empowering, inclusive, ethical remembrance, solemn, as not only reminds us of the depths to which the Holocaust went in building on preceding hatreds, but also make us alert to the rise of xenophobia and the rhetoric of hatred, and encourage us to renew our commitment and our shared response to human vulnerabilities and possibilities. And may it help in the evolution of our collective consciousness towards one that will share together the joy and fulfillment of peace. Gwym Siakando and Ilio Tantaki Barbana.
I invite Professor Thomas O'Dowd, Chairperson of Holocaust Education Ireland, to introduce this evening of remembrance.
The Holocaust has a diaspora that reaches far beyond the infamous sites where it occurred. In fact, thousands of survivors and their descendants live in many different countries around the world, a handful of whom came to Ireland. While they began life here as immigrants, through time and generational change, they have become Irish. Through education, we refute Holocaust distortion and denial by providing historically accurate information about the Holocaust and its consequences. We aim to challenge anti-Semitism and all forms of racism and discrimination, encouraging acceptance and respect for all people, fostering a diverse, inclusive, and equal society. With few Holocaust survivors left to carry the burden of memory, the lessons of history grow dangerously dim. It becomes even more important to educate generations now living. We urge young people in our midst to speak out against the scourge of discrimination, prejudice, and hatred, so that they might learn the lessons from the past that are relevant to their lives today.
The Stockholm Declaration 2000, of which Ireland is a signatory, is an international intergovernmental agreement between countries, committing them to commemorating and educating about the Holocaust. I invite Minister Paschal Donoghue to read an extract from that important document.
We, the governments attending the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, recognise that it was a tragically defining episode of the 20th century. It was a crisis for Europe. It was a universal catastrophe. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization. After more than half a century, it remains an event close enough in time that survivors can still bear witness to the horrors that engulfed the Jewish people. The terrible suffering of millions of Jews and other victims of the Nazis has left an indelible stain across Europe that must forever be seared in our collective memory. The selfless sacrifices of those who defied the Nazis and sometimes gave their own lives to protect or rescue Holocaust victims must also be inscribed in our hearts. We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote education, remembrance, and research about the Holocaust in our schools, our universities, our communities, and in other institutions. With humanity still scarred by anti-Semitism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, racism, xenophobia, and other expressions of hatred, we commit to fight against these evils and to reaffirm our common aspiration for a democratic and for a tolerant society, free of prejudice and free of other forms of bigotry.
I invite Senator Michael McDowell to tell us about the challenges of racism and hatred that we face today.
Ireland's first National Holocaust Memorial Day was held in Dublin City Hall on the 25th of January 2003. And on that occasion, I was invited to address the commemoration, a national event, as Minister for Justice, Equality and Law Reform. I delivered then a belated and profound apology on behalf of the Irish state for its manifest refusal and failure in the years leading up to and after the Holocaust to provide refuge to those Jewish victims of Nazi persecution who vainly looked to Ireland for protection. That terrible failure was largely due to ignorance and anti-Semitic prejudice, which was by no means uncommon in a society, albeit one which unusually in Europe had in its recently adopted written constitution expressly recognized its Jewish community, guaranteed their religious liberties, and guaranteed to protect them from discrimination. In our century, 2/3 of Europe's Jews were systematically murdered during the Shoah, and in an attempt to annihilate them along with their culture and their identities. Their fate, as has been said, was shared by hundreds of thousands of other victims of cruel prejudice, including Roma, Sinti, homosexuals, and others who were regarded as untermenschen. The unspeakable suffering, brutality, fear, and despair of the millions of innocent victims, men, women, and children who perished unheard by humanity, call out to us across the intervening decades to be heard and to be remembered. But commemoration by itself, while essential, is insufficient. In relation to social media, some now speak of a right to be forgotten. The victims of the Holocaust have a right not to be forgotten, and we all in Ireland share a corresponding duty never to forget them. The same social media have the capacity and the power to anonymously create, stoke, manipulate, and ignite race hatred. Anti-Semitism is real and takes many forms. Like all racism, it's the dry tinder for violence, for hatred, for division, for discrimination, for subjugation, and for fear. Anti-Semitic and other race hate statements and actions are as wrong and need to be as much countered in the third decade of this century as they were 90 years ago. The Irish state solemnly bound itself as a signatory to the Stockholm Declaration on the Holocaust to commemorate its victims, to study and to educate its people about its consequences, and to confront the underlying dangers in racism. This is the vital mission of our hosts this evening, Holocaust Education Ireland. As citizens loyal to the Irish state, itself a state committed constitutionally to international justice and morality, and to the generally accepted principles of international law, each of us is equally bound to uphold and to abide by those aims and values, not just by commemoration, but by our words and deeds.
A handful of Jewish Holocaust survivors live in Ireland. All of them were children during the Holocaust, and all of them found their way to Ireland by different means. Each of them lost many family members in the Shoah, and each has his or her own personal tale of survival. Tommy Reichenthal came to Ireland in 1959. For 50 years, he didn't speak about his experiences during the Holocaust. He just couldn't. I invite Tommy to share his story with us.
I am here today. I am here today not because what I am, but because who I am. I am a Jew and I am a survivor of the Holocaust. I was born in Slovakia in 1935. I was just 9 years old when I was captured by the Gestapo, the Nazis, along with my mother, brother, grandmother, aunt, and cousin. We were herded into a cattle cart, and from that moment onwards, we were treated worse than animals. There was no privacy, no hygiene. The stench and conditions were unbearable. Eventually, after 7 nights, the cattle train stopped. The doors were opened and we were greeted by shouts from the SS with gun pointing and barking dogs. We had arrived at our destination, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I was there from November 1944 until the liberation of the camp in April 1945. What I witnessed as a 9-year-old boy is impossible to describe. The starvation, the cruelty of the camp guard, the cold, disease, people who were just skin and bone and looked like living skeletons were walking around very slowly. Some of them dropping to the ground, never to get up again. They were dying in their hundreds, their emaciated bodies left where they fell or thrown onto a heap. In front of our barracks, there were piles of decomposing corpses. For many prisoners in Bergen-Belsen, the conditions were too much to bear, and they threw themselves on the barbed wire at night to be shot in order to put an end to their misery. We found their bodies, their corpses, there in the morning. 70,000 prisoners of Bergen-Belsen are buried there in mass grave. I lost 35 members of my family in the Holocaust.
The boycotts of Jewish businesses and professions in April and May 1933 were soon followed by book burnings and discrimination against Jewish artists throughout Germany. Gradually, Jewish people were squeezed out of German society. I invite Brendan Teeling of Dublin City Library and Archive to give his reading.
The Nazis put up posters in the windows of Jewish-owned businesses and professions, warning German citizens to defend themselves and not to patronize them. Jewish religious books, books about Jews and books by Jewish authors were burned in public bonfires, along with other books by writers who the Nazis condemned as un-German. Book burnings took place throughout Germany, where some of the finest works of literature, history, philosophy, science, and art were all destroyed. This was intended to leave Jews and Germans bereft of learning about their culture, their history, and their heritage. Art created by Jewish artists was condemned as degenerate. Their paintings and artworks were ripped from public exhibitions and private homes, much of it destroyed. Jewish artists were ridiculed and beaten in public, and works of art owned by Jewish people were stolen by the Nazis. Jewish actors, film directors, and artists were no longer able to find work, and Jewish composers and musicians were dismissed. Very soon, Jews were not allowed in public places such as cafes, the opera, cinemas, theatres, swimming pools, ice rinks, bookshops, or barbers. They could no longer sit on park benches which had "Not for Jews" stenciled on them. Jewish people were not allowed to ride on trams. There were Nazi police everywhere, preventing Jews from going wherever they had always been able to go.
The Nuremberg laws of 1935 had profound impact for German Jews. I invite Liam Herrick of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission to tell us about them.
The Nuremberg laws were designed to make Jewish people disappear from German society. Jews were deprived of their German citizenship. Jewish people were prohibited from marrying or having relationships with non-Jewish Germans. This law was soon extended to include Roma, black people, and other ethnic minorities. For the first time, Jews were defined as a race. As restrictions tightened, Jews found it increasingly difficult to earn a living. They were no longer able to work in the civil service, in academia, or in the media. Jewish businesses were appropriated by the Nazi state, and Jewish banks and bank accounts held by Jews were confiscated. The Nuremberg laws disenfranchised Jews and deprived them of their civil rights and their human rights. Jewish people were desperate to leave Germany to find somewhere safe.
By July 1938, as pressure increased on Jews to leave Germany and German-occupied lands, hundreds of thousands tried to flee. Anticipating a Jewish refugee crisis, President Roosevelt convened an international conference in Evian, France, to discuss offering refuge to Jewish people. I invite Teresa Bushkovska, migrant rights campaigner, to give her reading.
"32 countries were represented at the Evian conference, including Ireland. Delegates were asked if they would accept Jewish refugees. Most countries said they had no room for Jews, or that their quotas were already full. One country even stated that no Jew is too many. With nowhere to turn, Jews found themselves trapped within their own borders. Today, people are still fleeing discrimination, persecution, tyranny, and war, desperate to find refuge somewhere safe. Those challenges are still impacting the world we live in.
The state-sanctioned violence of the November pogrom in 1938 marked a turning point in Nazi persecution of Jewish people. Kim Bielenberg, whose maternal grandfather, Fritz Dietloff von der Schulenburg, participated in the failed plot to assassinate Hitler in July 1944, will give his reading.
The November pogrom, also known as Kristallnacht, erupted across Germany and Austria as the SS, Nazi police, Hitler Youth, and locals rampaged through the streets on that November night. Hundreds of synagogues, Jewish schools, and businesses were destroyed and set ablaze. Windows were smashed, leaving the streets strewn with glass. 91 Jews were beaten to death, and hundreds died later of their injuries. Some 30,000 Jewish men were thrown into concentration camps. Jewish cemeteries were desecrated, and thousands of apartments and shops belonging to the Jewish people were looted. After the destruction, the Jewish communities were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks to pay for the damage. After years of official harassment of Jews in Nazi Germany, the state-sanctioned violence of Kristallnacht marked the acceleration of Jewish persecution that would ultimately culminate in the Holocaust.
I invite Tabi Madide to tell us about the rules of identification imposed upon Jewish people by the Nazis. Youth reader Itai Kaspi will read from the diary of 15-year-old Yitzhak from Vilna.
The Nazis forced Jewish people to wear identifying badges, such as yellow stars of David, to be worn on their outer clothing, or white armbands with blue stars on them. Everyone in Germany was required to carry identity papers, but special identifying marks were added to those of Jewish people. A large red letter J was stamped on their passports, and the middle names of Sarah for females and Israel for males were introduced. All of these measures enabled the Nazi police to easily identify Jews.
The decree was issued that the Vilna Jewish population must put on badges, front and back. I was ashamed to appear in them on the street, not because it would be noticed that I'm a Jew, but because I was ashamed of what they were doing to us. I was ashamed of our helplessness.
More than 1,000 ghettos were created throughout Nazi-occupied Europe, usually in rundown areas of cities or large towns, from where thousands would be deported to transit camps, concentration camps, slave labor camps, killing sites, or death camps. I invite Dermot Lacey of Dublin City Council to give his reading. Youth reader Ofri Caspi will read from the diary of 13-year-old Ava from Romania.
Jews, Roma, communists homosexuals and political opponents of the regime were incarcerated in Nazi ghettos, which were created in every country occupied by Germany. It is estimated that 1 million people died in them. Many ghettos were walled in or fenced off, and residents who left without permission were severely punished, often shot. The brutality, harsh living conditions, starvation rations, and disease added to the death toll. It suited the Nazis if they could claim that the people in the ghettos were dying from natural causes. The inhabitants of the ghettos, who came from all walks of life, soon realized that the ghettos served as a place to destroy them physically and psychologically, and their ultimate fate would be death. Although there are heroic stories of resistance, most of them failed. In the end, all the ghettos created by the Nazis were razed and their populations murdered. There were few survivors.
We are here 5 days, but it seems like 5 years. First, the fence was finished and nobody can go out or come in. And on every house they've posted a notice which tells us exactly what we are allowed to do. Actually, everything is forbidden. But the most awful thing is that the punishment for everything is death. It doesn't actually say that this punishment also applies to children, but I think it does apply to us too.
I invite David Delaney, Assistant Secretary of the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, to tell us about the Nazi camps and the killing squads.
There were hundreds of concentration camps, slave labour camps and transit camps within the Nazi camp system. They were run by the SS, and many also had several sub-camps. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners succumbed to brutality, starvation, cold and disease in these places of incarceration. In June 1941, Germany swept into the Eastern Territories and Western Russia. The German army was followed by special killing units called Einsatzgruppen, tasked with killing Jews in all towns and villages they passed through. The killing squads were comprised of Nazis, SS, police officers, members of the German army, and thousands of local collaborators. They rounded up Jews in stelts, towns and villages, forcing them into cemeteries, forests and ravines, where they were murdered in their thousands at point-blank range. Many were forced to dig mass graves before being shot into them. Entire Jewish communities totaling some 1.5 million Jews, as well as thousands of other victims, were annihilated by this method of face-to-face killing.
Word reached Berlin that some members of the killing squads found their work distressing. They asked head office to find a more efficient way of murdering Jews. The Wannsee Conference was convened on the 20th of January 1942. I invite Barbara Nolan, former EU Commission representation in Ireland, to tell us about the meeting.
Reinhard Heydrich, Chief of the Reich Security Main Office, summoned 15 delegates to a meeting in a lakeside villa at Wannsee, outside Berlin. He asked them to endorse Hitler's plans for the total annihilation of the Jewish people of Europe. Eichmann presented the delegates with a list of the number of Jews living in each European country who the Nazis intended to murder. Ireland appears on the list with a total of 4,000 Jews. The inclusion of Ireland on the Wannsee list has a huge significance for the Irish Jewish community. Had the war taken a different course, the Nazis not been defeated? The delegates debated who was Jewish according to bloodline considerations and discussed evacuation and resettlement, euphemisms for murder. They concluded that a more efficient method of killing was possible, one that would produce little residue and spare those operating the killing sites the negative psychological trauma of face-to-face killing. In less than 2 hours, the delegates gave their unanimous support for the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question, the establishment of the death camps in which Jewish people and other victims would be murdered by poison gas.
I invite Patrick J. Houlihan of the Department of History at Trinity College Dublin to tell us about the Nazi death camps. Youth reader Niamh Siani will read from the memoir of Kitty Hart Moxon from Poland, who was 16 years old when she was imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau. She still speaks about her experiences.
6 death camps were created by the Nazis, all of them on Polish soil, where approximately 3 million Jews and thousands of other victims were murdered in gas chambers. Prisoners were selected for life or death. 90% were selected to die. They were ushered into undressing areas where they were told to leave their clothes neatly on numbered pegs and to tie their shoes together to make them easier to find when they came back from the showers. They never came back. Their clothing, shoes, and personal belongings were sorted and sold in markets back in Germany. Human hair was used in the manufacture of textiles. This systematic industrial process of murder was unprecedented in human history.
As evening came, the whole sky was red. Smoke and flames were pouring out of all the chimneys. None of us slept that night. It was no longer possible to pretend, even to yourself, that the stories were not really true. All that we had heard and guessed was now before our eyes. Here were the death factories. Today, in 2025, it is barely credible to someone like myself who lived through the worst of it, that members of the younger generation cannot believe it happened at all. But I did live through it, and I do know it happened. I was there.
The Holocaust was unprecedented in its planning, execution, and its intent to destroy the entire Jewish people, their culture, and their history. Andrew Wolfe, President of the Jewish Representative Council of Ireland, will give his reading.
The final solution was the systematic intent by the Nazis and their collaborators to murder every Jew in every country of Europe, stretching as far north as Norway, and as far south as Rhodes, and as far east as Russia, and as far west as Ireland. They also included those Jews living in the countries of North Africa and Arab lands. 6 million Jews perished in the Holocaust. 1.5 million of those victims were children. The Nazis also murdered millions of other victims, but as Elie Wiesel reminds us, it is true that not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims.
We will now hear a Roma song called The Burning Barn. This song was created by a group of Polish Roma who were captured by the Nazis. The Roma could not send messages to each other, but they knew other Roma were heading for the town with their families. So they created this song to warn them of the fate that awaited them. And they sang this song repeatedly as a warning. Through this song, many Roma lives were saved. I invite Monika Paszkowska, a member of the Polish Roma community, to sing this poignant song.
Widziałem motyla, jak w górę się wzbił. Miał skrzydła zranione, sączyła się z nich krew. Chciał walczyć, lecz nie mógł, bo brakło mu sił. Ten promyk słoneczny w górę się wbił. Ach, dali doliro małe, oj sopeskiereł, bo foro już na dór i duda hacion. Oj, Syria me preskiras, och, Syria me daras, a soske tu me traden, bezamary będzian. Ach, dali doliro małe, oj, sopeskiereł, bo foro już na dór i duda hacion, bo foro już na dór i duda hacion.
We must prevent future generations from thinking of the Holocaust in terms of anonymous, faceless numbers. Every victim has a name. Several people in Ireland lost cherished family members in the Holocaust, whose names we have included in the scroll of names. For some of them, we know their place of birth, their country of origin, their age, and their place of death. For others, we have only their names. And these are included in the scroll. In this small way, we honour their memory and give them a personal Irish memorial. I invite students from Stratford College Dublin, Blackrock College Dublin, Temple Carrick School, Greystones, County Wicklow. Unfortunately, St. Jarlath's College Toom wasn't able to make it today because of the storm, and we appreciate BBYO, who are stepping in at the 11th hour. I invite them to read from the scroll of names.
Max Heller, Clara Heller, Gisela Mullner, Sander Mullner, Baila Hirschberg, Matthias Hirschberg, Rukla Orzel, Feivel Orzel, Slasma Urbach, Hirsch Urbach, Toba Urbach, David Joseph Urbach, Shaul Urbach, Abe Tzvi Urbach, Gitla Freila Urbach, Leah Fegla Urbach, Nuchim Mordecai Urbach, Rukla Golda Urbach, Sarah Urbach,
Fagela Urbach, Perla Urbach, Frimetta Urbach, Moses Klein, Hilda Frankel, Kurt Frankel, Walter Frankel, Herbert Frankel, Fritz Frankel, Zygmunt Frankel, Salman Del Monte, Caroline Wolf, Martin Wolf, Wolfgang Wolf,
Rosetta Wolf, Eli Velva Lavisansky, David Philip, Racha Philip, Leopold Philip, Julia Philip, Dagbert Philip, Louis Philip, Valeria Philip, Rosalia Shaimovich, Julius Mayer, Geza Suri, Oscar Shaimovich, Angela Fried, Bella
Ezekiel
Fried,
Reichenthal,
Katerina
Katerina
Fried,
Reichenthal,
Agnes
Kalmar
Fried,
Reichenthal, Iona Reichenthal, Kita Reichenthal, Ibi Reichenthal, Desidir Reichenthal, Fernand Alt, Renga Alt, Una Elbert, Marta Elbert, Joseph Drexler, Patriska Drexler, Paul Drexler, Meta Drexler,
Avisha
Bella
Mataya,
Pillberg,
Ankisha
Uma
Mataya,
Popper, Yura
Carmen
Mataya,
Rosenthal, Eleonora Rosenthal, Abraham Sustiel, Paulin Sustiel, David Sustiel, Shimon Sustiel, Regina Sustil, Rapé Sustil, Marta Sustil, Shabbatai Sustil, Lucy Sustil, Moshe Yom Tov Sustil, Adela Sustil, Agedni Sustil Brudo,
Heinrich
Emmanuel
Heinbach,
Brudo,
Selma
Sustil
Heinbach,
children,
Simcha Zaks, Rivka Zaks, Burrell Zaks, Zissa Zaks, Nachman Zaks, Chana Zaks, Aaron Zaks, Chana Sherhai, Joel Dov Zaks, Bendit Zaks, Leah Tzedek, Gittel Zaks, Shoshana Zaks, Shana
Carla Feig
Zaks,
Faulkner,
Masha
David Nair
Zaks,
Faulkner,
Rosa
Moshi
Zaks,
Faulkner, Garla Faulkner, Shanda Millicaman, Yehiel Millicaman, Theo Millicaman, Joseph Millicaman, Pepe Grzib, Haya Millicaman, Yoavet Millicaman, Haim Meir Millicaman, Nusun Nut Faulkner, Esther Zarka Yakovich, Mim Alt Millicaman, Levi
Joanna
Folker,
Cosberg Sommer,
Izzy
Emil
Folker,
Sommer,
Nathan
Etty
Folker,
Steinberg, Leon Gluck, Wojciech Gluck, Haskell Abram, Belia Abram, Ossia Joseph Abram, Sigmund Selig Cohn, Ida Cohn, Heinrich Herbst, Caroline Herbst, Elsa Zimak, Denny Zimak, Abraham Humberg, Emma Humberg,
Adolf Humberg,
Gerda Feist,
Raphael
Fanny
German,
Kaufman,
Carl German, David German, Hannah Matla Zibner, Rivka Zibner, Baby Zibner, Mindla Zibner, Zulum Zibner, Frandla Zibner, daughter of Frandla Zibner, Sheendla Zibner, Joseph Zibner, Joseph Zibner, Mendel Kersner, Shina Bela Kersner, Osei Kersner, Shina Riva Kersner, Shifra
Wanda
Kersner,
Camarina,
Rash
Nashim
Kersner,
Dikori,
Yankel
Tala
Kersner,
Camarina, Julia Dikori, Miriam Navtulovichova, March Moisa Yuchak Navtulovich, Myra Navtulovich, Sidonia Navtulovichova, Hani Moskovichova, Chaim Moskovich, Benjamin Moskovich, March Moskovich, Isidore Moskovich, Shimshon Hertz, Kayla Hertz, Shindal Hertz, Avraham Hertz,
Maya
Hertz
Roshovsky,
Yosef
Rachel
Hertz,
Roshovsky, Kayla Roshovsky, Hirsch Roshovsky, Roman Patskowski, Kalina Patskowska-Robach, Helena Patskowska, Karolina Patskowska, Leocadia Patskowska, Lucian Patskowski, Josef Patskowski, Tadeusz Patskowski, Max Meyer Rothschild, Minnie Flesch Rothschild, William Carl Leopold Rothschild,
Sayama
Grunia
Kachov,
Cherkov,
Devora
Max
Krasnik,
Krachov,
Miriam
Miklaya Cherkov,
Krasnik, Henna Krasnik, Freya Krasnik, Annie Otten-Wolf, David Galassin, Jeanette Galassin, Paul Talma, Sarah Talma, Isaac Shishi, Ephraim Sachs, Lena Jean Sachs, Ada Liesel Israel, Bernard Israel, Liesel Laura Wolf, Ernst Steinhol, Lillian Steinhol.
I invite Evelyn Byrne to tell us about the anguish of liberation. 5 youth readers will share testimonies of survivors, and we will hear the poignant account from Irish writer and war correspondent Dennis Johnston, who accompanied the American liberating forces as they entered Buchenwald in April 1945. Eli Smith.
My number is 174517. We have been baptized. We will carry the tattoo on our left arms until we die.
The Nazi camps were liberated, one after the other, as Soviet, American, and British troops pushed the Germans out of occupied Europe and deeper into their own territory in the spring of 1945. With their advance, they made horrific discoveries as they breached the perimeter fences of the SS concentration camps. There were many Jewish soldiers in the Soviet army. Nothing prepared the liberators for what they witnessed when they entered those camps.
Katie Quayle.
The camp guard who came to the gate said, "You are free and you can leave." All the guards with the dogs that used to stand in every corner had disappeared. It was all gone, as though it had never been. It was one of the miracles. The Russians entered, and we were in such a condition that no one moved, no one went out. We did not laugh, we were not happy, we were apathetic. A general came in, he was Jewish. He told us that he was delighted, as this was the first camp in which he had found people still alive. He started to cry, but we didn't. He wept, and we didn't.
6 to 7 million displaced people were liberated by the Allied forces. Yet, in spite of all the difficulty involved in transporting and providing for this mass of humanity in war-ravaged Europe, the military managed to repatriate nearly 6 million of the non-Jewish survivors by September 1945, those who had the option of returning to their homes and families. Then there were the 250,000 Jewish displaced survivors who had survived the horrors of the Nazi camp. However terrible the fate of the non-Jewish displaced persons, it may have been, but it does not compare to the tragedy of the Jewish people.
Lily Foster.
It seems to us that for the time being, mankind does not comprehend what we have gone through and what we have experienced during this period of time. And it seems to us, neither shall we be understood in the future. We unlearned to laugh. We cannot cry anymore. We do not comprehend our freedom yet.
Liberation was not always joyful for the survivors of the Holocaust, especially the Jewish survivors who had lost everything: their families, their homes, their property, their belongings. Most had no one left and no home to go to. They called themselves Shearit Halepta, the spared remnant. As the Allied troops reached Poland and Germany, they confronted the horrors of the Holocaust. They found emaciated humans still alive and hundreds of thousands of corpses. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest camp and the most notorious killing center of all, they found 7,600 prisoners still alive. 836,500 items of women's clothing. 348,800 items of men's clothing. 43,400 pairs of shoes. Hundreds of thousands of spectacles. 7 tons of human hair. Every item of clothing, each pair of shoes, and each pair of spectacles had once belonged to an individual human being.
Akiko Chong.
So for us, even the hour of liberty rang out grave and muffled, and filled our souls with joy and yet also with pain. Nothing could ever happen good and pure enough to rub out our past. The scars of the outrage would remain with us forever, in the memories of those who saw it, in the places where it occurred, and in the stories that we shall tell of it.
Irish writer and war correspondent Dennis Johnson, April 1945. I went in. At one end lay a heap of smoking clothes, amongst which a few ghouls picked and searched, for what, God only knows. As we entered the long hut, the stench hit us in the face, and a queer wailing sound came to our ears. Along both sides of the shed was tier upon tier of what can only be described as shelves. And lying on these, packed tightly, side by side, like knives and forks in a chest, were living creatures. Some of them stirring, some of them stiff and silent, but all of them skeletons, with the skin drawn tight over their bones, with heads bulging and misshapen from emancipation, with burning eyes and sagging jaws. And as we came in, those with strength to do so turned their heads and gazed at us, and from their lips came that thin, unearthly sound. Then I realized what it was. It was meant to be cheering. They were cheering the uniform that I wore. They were cheering for the hope that it brought them. We walked the length of the shed and then through another one. From the shelves, feeble arms rose and waved like twigs in a breeze.
Senna Manigo.
We had been liberated. I was no longer only a number doomed to die in a Nazi gas chamber, a prisoner without the right to life. Germany had been defeated. Once again, I was an ordinary girl. True, I was different from other girls my age, very, very different in many ways. But I was free.
I invite Stephen Benedict to tell us about resistance during the Holocaust.
People often ask, how come Jewish people didn't rebel or resist their Nazi oppressors? Of course they resisted. There were insurrections, revolts and rebellions in most of the ghettos, concentration camps, and even in the death camps. All of them failed. Throughout the war, there were heroic acts of resistance by individuals, groups, and nations. Armed resistance was undertaken by non-Jewish and Jewish partisan groups, such as the Bielski brothers, operating in Belarus, who protected and saved some 1,200 Jews. The partisans fought the Nazis from the forests and peripheral areas of occupied lands. There were spiritual resistances, where Jews risked their lives to maintain their religious observance in the ghettos and in the camps. And there were clandestine movements, such as the White Rose Group, led by students Sophie and Hans Scholl, who were ultimately arrested and executed in 1943. In that same year, a group of young resistors organized an uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, which, at its peak, held some 400,000 inmates. The insurgents lasted 27 days and was doomed to fail. The resistors were killed, and the Germans razed the ghetto to the ground, reporting to Berlin that the former Jewish quarter in Warsaw is no more. In March 1943, the people of Bulgaria refused to hand over their Jewish communities to the Nazis, although they did not save some 11,000 Jews from the territories of Macedonia and Thrace. And in September 1943, on hearing that the Jews of Denmark were about to be deported, the Danish people rescued their Jewish compatriots by forming a flotilla of every kind of seaworthy vessel to ferry them to safety in neutral Sweden.
In 1963, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Authority in Israel, inaugurated the award of Righteous Among the Nations to honor non-Jewish people who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. I invite Amina Mustafa of Sport Against Racism Ireland to tell us about these heroic people.
The righteous come from all walks of life and backgrounds. Individuals, groups of friends, families, whole villages, organizations and diplomats. They were nations such as Denmark, Bulgaria and Albania, the bishops and the mayor of the Greek island of Zakynthos, who saved their Jewish communities. They were also righteous Germans, righteous Nazis, righteous Arabs and righteous Muslims. Priests and nuns throughout occupied Europe risked their lives to provide false documents for Jews, as did diplomats such as Raoul Wallenberg and Zempo Sugihara and many others. Mary Elms is the first Irish person to be awarded the Righteous title. Working with her colleagues in the south of France, they succeeded in saving more than 200 Jewish children from the Nazis. Not only those Jews who have been personally saved by the righteous owe them their lives, but all of their descendants do too.
There are thousands of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors living in the world today. Several live in Ireland, and some of them are with us here this evening. They have grown up with the legacy of the Holocaust in their families. I invite Corinna Camarino to tell us about her grandfather, Enzo.
As a third-generation survivor, I sometimes think of how unlikely it is that I exist at all. All four of my grandparents are survivors of the Holocaust. My Romanian grandfather was a prisoner in a work camp until he escaped. My French grandmother was hidden in the countryside with her family and escaped arrest because the entire village conspired to protect them, warning them and hiding them behind a false wall built into a barn whenever soldiers were nearby. My Italian grandmother's family was tipped off by a police commissioner to be out of town on the day the SS rounded up the Jews of Rome on the 16th of October, 1943. My Italian grandfather's family was arrested that day and deported to Auschwitz. Of the 1,022 people who were rounded up on the 16th of October, 1943, only 16 people survived. My grandfather, Enzo, was one of the survivors. After the war, he made it back to Italy and eventually to Canada, where he raised his family. He named his son Italo and his daughter Julia after his own father and mother, who were murdered in Auschwitz. All of my grandparents have died now, and I feel responsible to speak out about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. I can't forget that the danger of people harming other people hasn't gone away. This history is not that long ago. I'm raising my son, a fourth-generation survivor, to be proud of his culture, his religion, and his family history. We exist because my grandparents survived.
Jonathan Phillips will tell us about his father.
My father, Geoffrey Phillips, was born in 1925 in Vanna Eichel, a small town in northern Germany, just 30 kilometers to the west of Dortmund. I remember his recollection of the November pogrom known as Kristallnacht, the night of breaking glass, which took place on the 9th of November 1938. My dad spoke about the sheer horror of that night and hearing that their local synagogue had been set on fire and burnt to the ground by squads of Hitler Youth, and learning that similar atrocities had happened to the homes, businesses, synagogues and schools of Jewish communities throughout Germany. Shortly after breakfast on the following morning, there was a loud knock on the door. Two plainclothes policemen instructed my grandfather to pack a change of clothes, and they took him away. Not long after, my grandmother learned that Britain was prepared to offer asylum to a limited number of Jewish children, and she reluctantly arranged to send her only child, Geoffrey, on a kinder transport. And so he arrived to England in the midst of a very severe winter in December 1938. He never saw his parents again. He was just 13 and a half years old. Initially, my dad kept in touch with his parents by limited communication via the Red Cross. But with the outbreak of war, the letters ceased. The last letter that he received ended with, "Look after yourself and Godspeed," which he interpreted to be a coded message that his parents then realized their destiny. Tomorrow, the 27th of January, will be the 81st anniversary of my grandfather's murder at the Stutthof death camp in northern Poland, where he died along with some 65,000 other deportees who perished as victims of the Nazis by starvation, typhoid, lethal injection, or gas. After the war, Geoffrey remained in England, where he married and later came to Ireland in 1950 with his wife, my mother, Phyllis. They had 3 sons born here in Ireland, David, Jonathan, and Robert, and I am their middle son.
I invite Vanessa Paszkowska to tell us about her great-grandfather and the genocide of the Roma during the Holocaust.
My great-grandfather, Edward Paszkowski, survived the massacre of 77 Roma, including 8 members of my family, in a village of Kharkiv in northern Poland. The remains of the victims were left strewn in a mass grave. No acknowledgement or justice of this atrocity has been forthcoming, and there is yet a marker or memorial erected on the site. My great-grandmother, Krystyna Paszkowska, survived a Roma ghetto in Chelsea, Gęsiborki, where she met my great-grandfather. They fell in love, they married, and they had 7 children. My parents came to Ireland in 1999, and my sister and I were born here. Last year, in 2024, we returned to Poland for the 80th anniversary of the genocide of the Roma people during the Holocaust in 1944. The tragedy of the Roma has impacted the community around the world to this day.
I invite Yoram Tokar, who will tell us about his great aunts and uncles in France.
After securing the agreement of the Vichy government, German officials and French police worked together conducting roundups of Jews in both the occupied and unoccupied zones of France. In Paris, Adolf Eichmann began a program of isolating French Jews, first registering them, then placing them under curfew, forcing them to wear yellow stars of David, and banning them from public places. Some 28 foreign Jewish refugees were imprisoned in camps where the able-bodied were drafted for slave labor. In 1941, the transit camp at Drancy was set up in a suburb of Paris in preparation of deportations to the east. Designed to hold 700 persons, at its peak, Drancy held 7,000. As deportations increased, an infamous roundup took place in Paris on the 16th and 17th of July 1942. 12,884 Jewish men and women, including 4,051 children, were brought to the Vélodrome d'Hiver, an indoor stadium in Paris. The Jews were kept there for 5 miserable days under deplorable conditions: poor ventilations, little food, water, or sanitary facilities. Parisians nearby could hear the wailing of the internees day and night. Eventually, they were transferred to Drancy, where their children were separated from their parents, who were deported to Auschwitz. Many of their children stayed for several weeks in Drancy, while a large number of them died from lack of care. Finally, they too were sent directly to Auschwitz, where most of them were gassed on arrival. Only 811 Jews survived the roundup of La Grande Rafle. My family was torn apart by La Rafle du Vélodrome d'Hiver. My grandmother's brother and sister, David and Janet, who were 21 and 19 years old, were visiting their uncle Paul and Aunt Sarah Talma in Paris. They were among the Jewish citizens rounded up during La Rafle. Great Uncle David died in Drancy transit camp. Paul and Sarah Talma, along with my grand-aunt Janet, were sent from Drancy to Auschwitz, where their lives ended in the gas chamber in August 1942.
I invite Molly Zinn Collis to tell her about her grandfather and grandaunt.
My grandfather Zoltan and his sister Edith were very young children when they were found in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp by Dr. Bob Collis, who brought them back to Ireland and reared them with his own family. Zoltan added the name of Collis to his own. Survivors of the Holocaust have very few relations and have got used to having very small families, at least from one side. No grandparents, no uncles, no aunts, and no cousins. But now, as a third-generation survivor, I have a few more cousins than my parents had, who are the children of my aunts and uncles, so our family has grown a little bigger. We have been endowed with the title of second or third generation, and this brings with it an important responsibility to transmit the memory of the Holocaust to future generations. And we can also rejoice in our own lives, in our own families, our children, and our grandchildren. Hitler did not win. One or both of our parents or grandparents survived, and we are here, living our lives and looking towards the future.
Kyla Hertz will tell us about her grandparents.
"33 members on both sides of my family were killed in the Holocaust. Most of them were shot into a mass grave in a forest or put into the gas chambers in Auschwitz. I am here today because of 3 that survived: my paternal grandfather, Wolf, and my maternal great-grandparents, Lenka and Avram. Wolf was 27 when his family was rounded up and taken to a labor camp in Drohobych, in the Polish-Ukrainian region that was then called Galicia. At the camp, they were separated into two groups. Wolf was the only member of his family to survive this selection process, as he was deemed able for hard labor. His parents and his siblings were taken to the nearby Bronica forest and shot into a mass grave. While Wolf was wheeling a barrow of bricks in the camp, he suffered a severe injury that he later found out was a broken back. He had just a few hours to make his decision to attempt to escape the camp. This was his only chance of survival. That night, he managed to dig a hole under the fence and he escaped. He fled into the forest and he hid for a year and a half, and he survived. My maternal great-grandmother Lenka was 17 when she and her family were transported from their village in Slovakia to Auschwitz, where she too was faced with a selection process that took all of her family members to the gas chambers, sparing only herself and one sister. After months of enduring Auschwitz, it was decided that she would go to Ravensbrück, a women's concentration camp in Germany, but that she would walk there in the middle of winter. This was a death march. The women would sleep huddled together in layers of circles, organizing it so that the youngest would be in the center. She recalled how the outer layers of women kept dying off along the way. When I think about Wolf and Lenka, I think about their bravery in an incomprehensible reality. How they chose to try against every single odd when it would have been easier and probably would have made more sense in those moments to give up. And I can be so proud of being born from them.
Joe Wieselski was born in Czechoslovakia in 1918. When Joe was 20 years old, Hitler invaded and Joe fled to the resistance. At the end of the war in 1945, Joe had lost both his parents and his brother, who were all murdered in Auschwitz.
1942 it was, that's when the transport started. They were the first transports to Auschwitz. But those days they were talking about working camps for 6 months. If you would have seen the people who were going to be transported, they bought shoes for work and so on. We didn't have any news. There were rumors that some people were shot, but until Alfred Wetzler escaped from Auschwitz and told us what's happening, we actually didn't. Because it was unbelievable. I mean, absolutely unbelievable. You know, we were worried how our parents will be able to survive the war, working hard there and so. We shouldn't have worried because they were, after arrival, they were a few days later murdered. And then I joined the Czechoslovakian brigade up in the mountains. I fought very hard, 44, 45. But it was tough, you know. In my brigade we had 400 boys. Only about 30 came back. Nobody left. I am the last one.
Virginia Pown, a member of the Roma community and a pupil at Scoldara Kilcock, wrote a very moving poem called Anna to mark the 80th anniversary of the genocide of the Roma people during the Holocaust. I invite Virginia to read her poem.
Anna.
I did it for her. I got up every day. I did it for her. The smell of human waste burning up our noses, pressed against the crack in the wood, desperate to be relieved. The train came to a halt. We swarmed to the exit. I carried Anna to the door. The air will do her good. Her head on my shoulder, she's lost. She doesn't speak. But I know what she's thinking. What will happen to our unborn children? We get off. Soldiers yelling, dogs barking, children crying. Amongst the commotion, big and broad, she stumbled to the infirmary. I never said goodbye. Deafening rifle shots led us to a place surrounded by electric wire. A gypsy camp, section B2E. We were herded to a washroom, told to undress. You could smell the shame flooding the room, thousands of distraught faces. I hesitated. All men, women, and children together in the same place. But the sound of pain from those who resisted ushered me to do it. After their taunting was over, after their fun was over, we had our hair cut. We were commanded to redress. What a privilege clothes are. Our arms then branded with a Z and some random numbers. We were told to forget our names. They didn't matter anymore. But how can you forget who you are? We were forced to construct roads which would lead other men to their deaths. We were fed morsels. Even the children, small as they were, would cry of hunger. People fell, dead like flies. Death is nothing new. Who had the strength to cry, to mourn? I counted the weeks. Anna should have given birth by now. I pleaded with a guard, what happened to my wife? I met with silence, nothing new. But he grins, looking back at black smoke coming from behind. The smell of burning flesh. The smell that welcomed us to our destiny ever since we walked through that gate. But I refused to believe people were that cruel. I shut down those daunting thoughts, but they swallowed me whole. My wife, my children, my will to live, gone. From that day onward, I walked around as a shadow, alive, but not living, breathing, but not out of my own will. I no longer pushed my stomach to suppress this gnawing pain. My legs don't carry me. They too give up. I don't flinch when the baton strikes. I wish he hit me harder. I wish I wasn't here. My mind and my heart left with her. The color, the light, died with her. I did it for her. I died every day. I did it for her. We'll meet again. Someday.
Dr. Bob Collis worked as a volunteer doctor in the former Bergen-Belsen concentration camp immediately after the war. He brought 6 Jewish orphans back with him to Ireland. Among those children were brother and sister Terry and Susie Molnar, who Bob arranged to have adopted by a Jewish couple, Willie and Elsa Samuels. I invite Susie Diamond to tell us her story.
I was born Susie Molnar in the town of Kozak in Hungary in 1942. We were a small family comprising my mother Gisela, my father Sandor, my brother Terry, and myself. In 1942, my father was forcefully conscripted into the slave labor service of the Hungarian army and deported to the Soviet Union, where he perished in 1943. Between July and September 1944, in just 8 weeks, Adolf Eichmann organized the roundup and deportation of nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews. They were sent directly to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where most of them perished in the gas chambers. During these weeks, the Gestapo came for my brother, and me. We were deported to Ravensbrück and then to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. My mother died shortly after liberation. Terry and I were very young children when we came to Ireland. We grew up believing we were the only 2 members of our family to have survived. In 2007, Terry passed away, and I was the only one left. But things changed in 2015 when I was discovered by a first cousin still living in Kozak, and I learned a little about my family. My father was one of 4 brothers who ran a timber business. 2 of them perished in the Holocaust, and 2 survived. I have also learned that I have first cousins living in Hungary and the United States. I have a family. I have visited Kozak and seen my grandfather's house, the Jewish cemetery where my grandparents are buried, and the synagogue where all my family prayed. 778 Jews lived in Kozak before the war. 461 of them were murdered in the Holocaust. Most important for me is the memorial scroll on the synagogue wall, recording the Jews from Kozak who perished in the Holocaust. My family is listed on this scroll, but this has to be corrected because my brother and I were not murdered. We survived. Today I am mindful that time is passing too quickly for my contemporaries and for me. What we experienced took place in the middle of the last century, far too distant for young people today to understand the enormity of what happened. 6 million Jews murdered because of their faith, more than the population of Ireland. I urge young people to speak out about hate speech, about bullying, and about Holocaust denial. I implore them to tell our story and to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for 1 minute's silence as we remember all the victims of the Holocaust. Thank you. It is customary at Holocaust Memorial events to light 6 candles in memory of the 6 million Jewish people who perished in the Shoah. In Ireland, we also light candles in memory of all the victims of the Holocaust. In memory of thousands of people with disabilities and disabling conditions who were murdered, forcibly sterilized, starved to death by doctors and other willing helpers, I invite Gary Carney and Carolyn Akintola of the Disability Federation of Ireland to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the genocide of the Roma, which took place during the Holocaust, when more than 250,000 Roma and Sinti people were rounded up, murdered, displaced, and forcibly sterilized by the Nazis, I invite Alexandra Paskowska and Anna Kokieva of the Roma community to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of ethnic minorities, mixed race, Poles and other Slavic people who were murdered, displaced, forcibly Aryanized and incarcerated in concentration camps, I invite Salome Mbugua of Akidwa Network of Migrant Women Living in Ireland and Louisa Rach, whose Jewish grandmother was a young girl when she was saved by a Polish Catholic family during the Holocaust, to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the thousands of gay men and women who were imprisoned in concentration camps where they were subjected to harder work, less food, and greater brutality than other inmates, thousands were murdered. I invite Anna Nolan of the National LGBT Federation and Dermot Ryan of Belong To light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the political victims of the Holocaust, communists, socialists, trades unionists, and political opponents of the Nazi regime who were persecuted and murdered, I invite David Joyce, Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and Barry Andrews, MEP, to light their candles. We will always remember. In memory of the Christian victims of all denominations who were persecuted and murdered by the Nazis, I invite Wendy Goodbody, Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, and Alan O'Sullivan, Chaplain, Trinity College Dublin, to light their candles. We will always remember. 6 candles are dedicated to the memory of the 6 million Jewish people, including 1.5 million children who were annihilated in the Holocaust. Jews were murdered in concentration camps, labor camps, and death camps. Jews perished in the ghettos. Jews died of starvation and disease. Jews were shot in the forests and in their villages. Jews were murdered in the streets and in their homes. Those lighting candles in memory of the Jewish victims of the Holocaust are children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. All of them lost countless members of their families in the Holocaust. Molly Zinn Collis, whose great-grandfather Zoltan Zinn and great-aunt Edith survived Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. Rivki Lent, whose grandfather, Naftali Lowenthal, great-grandparents Nettie and Yitzhak Lowenthal, fled Nazi persecution, but whose great-great-grandmother, Viga Beila Morgenstein, and several other family members perished in the Holocaust. Orla Kaminska, whose father, Jan Kaminski, escaped the massacre in his native village of Bilgoraj in Poland, where his parents, Mindla and Sulam, his 2 sisters, Chana and Rivka, baby brother, and other family members, all perished in the Holocaust. Yoram Tokar, whose great-aunt and uncle, David and Jeanette Galassin, Paul and Sarah, Talma and other family members perished in the Holocaust. Joe Katz, whose mother Frida survived Auschwitz, but whose many family members perished in the Holocaust. Kyla Hertz, whose grandfather Wolf Hertz escaped the massacre in the Bronice forest, and whose great-grandparents Lenka and Avram Muskovich survived Auschwitz, but whose other family members perished in the Holocaust. We will always remember. As our ceremony draws to a close, Chief Rabbi Yoni Weider will read the memorial prayer, which will then be sung in Hebrew by Carl Nelkin of the Irish Jewish community. May I ask you to please stand.
God of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the sheltering wings of your divine presence, among the holy and pure, who shine like the brightness of the firmament, for the souls of all the holy and pure, and the innocent, who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled at the hands of the Nazi oppressors in Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, and other concentration and death camps in Europe. We pray for those souls. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden, and may the Master of Mercy shelter them for eternity with the cover of his wings. And may he bind their souls in the bond of eternal life. May the Lord be their inheritance, and may they repose in peace upon their heavenly resting places. And let us say, Amen.
El Molei Rachamim Shochen Mamramim Hamesei Menuchonachana Al Kanfei Hashchino Bemalos Kedoshim Utaharim Kezohar Orokia Masirim Es Nishmos Achenu B'nei Yisrael Hakedoshim Ataharim Shenaflu B'dei Horoschim V'nishpach damam Ba'Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, Uvishar Machanos Hashmar Be'Europa, Shenehegu Shenishchatu, V'shenishrefu V'shenitbeyu, V'shenechneku Al Kiddush Hashem. בעבור שכל הקול הקדוש הזה מתפללים ביד אזכרות נשמתם. בגן עדן תהיה מנוחתם, לכן בעל הרחמים יתירי מססק כנופך לעולמים, וצרור משרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם. וינוחו על משכבתם בשלום, ונאמר אמן.
Professor Thomas O'Dowd will give his closing remarks.
It was the survivors themselves who first acknowledged their responsibility for passing on knowledge of the Holocaust and keeping its memory alive. For this reason, it is essential to teach about the Shoah, whether there are Jews in your respective countries or not, whether there are many or few or none left. The Shoah should never be diluted, never denied, distorted, or trivialized. Our generation and the generation or two after us will be the last that will be able to say that we stood and shook the hands of some of those who survived. Go home from this place. Tell your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren that today you looked into the eyes that witnessed the most cataclysmic events ever unleashed upon mankind by mankind. Tell them that you met people who will still be remembered and still talked about and still wept over 1,000 years from now. The Holocaust happened. It can happen again. Every one of us has a solemn duty to ensure that nothing like it ever occurs again.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in this evening of solemn commemoration.